close your eyes and imagine the very first cities ever built. Not towers of steel or glass, but mud brick walls rising slowly under the hot sun. Narrow streets wound through bustling marketplaces, where farmers traded grain and shepherds brought wool from the hills. Canals carried water to thirsty fields, and clay tablets recorded the earliest stories of gods and kings. This was the dawn of civilization, when humanity took its first steps from scattered villages into organized societies. From Mesopotamia's fertile plains to the ancient rivers of Egypt and beyond, people learned to shape the world with their hands, their tools, and their myths. But even the oldest civilizations, born from earth and ambition, faced the same fate: to rise, to flourish, and eventually to fall. Tonight, let us drift together through that story. From mud bricks to myths, from the first cities to the first empires, you'll hear the tale of the oldest civilizations, how they began, how they thrived, and how their memory still lingers in the whispers of history. So settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the world's first great stories to carry you into sleep. The birth of civilization in Mesopotamia. Long before steel, glass, and skyscrapers, humanity lived in small groups, scattered across plains, valleys, and riverbanks. For countless generations, survival meant moving with the seasons, following herds, gathering plants, and enduring the constant uncertainty of nature. But something changed in the heart of the ancient Near East, between the great rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, in the fertile land known as Mesopotamia, people began to settle. They discovered that by planting seeds and tending fields, they could create food surpluses. Farming gave them stability, and stability allowed them to stay in one place. Slowly, villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. Mud bricks, simple sun-dried blocks of earth, were stacked high to form walls, homes, and temples. From these humble beginnings, the world's first civilizations emerged. The earliest of these cities were places like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur. Eridu, often called the first city, held deep spiritual significance. According to Sumerian myths, it was founded by the gods themselves, a sacred site where civilization began. As more people gathered, communities became complex. Farmers grew barley and wheat. Shepherds raised sheep and goats. Potters shaped clay vessels, and metalworkers learned to forge tools. Life became organized around both survival and belief. Uruk, in particular, rose as a shining star of early civilization. By around 3000 BCE, it had grown into one of the largest cities in the world, with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Its walls stretched for miles, enclosing temples, workshops, markets, and homes. At the city's heart stood towering ziggurats, step platforms that reached toward the heavens, dedicated to gods like Inanna, goddess of love and war. These temples were not just places of worship, but centers of administration, where priests oversaw offerings, trade, and the city's resources. The invention of writing was one of Mesopotamia's greatest gifts to humanity. At first, it was a simple system of clay tokens used to count grain or livestock. Over time, these symbols evolved into cuneiform, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay tablets with a reed stylus. What began as bookkeeping grew into something far greater. Through cuneiform, people recorded laws, hymns, contracts, and stories. The earliest myths, like the tales of Gilgamesh, were etched into clay, ensuring that memory would outlive generations. Water was the lifeblood of these civilizations. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, though unpredictable and sometimes destructive, made agriculture possible. Canals and irrigation systems were carved into the land, directing water to fields of grain and date palms. Controlling water required cooperation, and cooperation required governance. Out of necessity, leaders rose, kings, priests, and councils who organized labor, collected surplus, and made decisions for the community. Yet, with progress came challenges. As cities grew, competition for resources intensified. Neighboring city-states often clashed, their armies marching across the plains to control farmland, trade routes, or sacred sites. Sumerian kings recorded their victories and defeats on clay tablets and carved steels. War, it seemed, was as old as civilization itself. Despite conflict, cultural achievements flourished. Mesopotamians developed mathematics, astronomy, and early medicine. They divided time into units we still use today: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They charted the movements of stars, recorded eclipses, and created calendars to guide planting and harvest. Their knowledge spread outward, influencing neighboring cultures for centuries to come. One of the most fascinating aspects of these early societies was their mythology. To the people of Mesopotamia, the world was filled with divine forces. Every city had its patron god or goddess who protected it and demanded offerings. Storms, floods, and droughts were seen as the will of the gods, blessings or punishments that shaped daily life. The myths spoke of creation, of floods, of heroes who sought immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest stories, told of a king who journeyed beyond the edge of the world in search of eternal life. Though he failed to escape death, his story captured the deepest questions of humanity. Why do we die? What gives life meaning? What remains after we are gone? Art and craftsmanship reflected both daily life and spiritual beliefs. Cylindrical seals, carved with intricate designs, were pressed into clay as signatures or symbols of ownership. Pottery depicted animals, gods, and geometric patterns. Jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli adorned both kings and commoners, hinting at trade networks that reached as far as Afghanistan and the Indus Valley. Trade, indeed, was vital to these early cities. Lacking natural resources like timber, stone, and metals, Mesopotamian societies exchanged grain, textiles, and crafted goods for raw materials. Caravans traveled across deserts, while boats navigated rivers, linking distant regions. Through trade, ideas and technology spread, weaving a wider web of human connection. But life was not easy. Floods could destroy harvests. Droughts could bring famine. Disease spread quickly in crowded cities. Social hierarchies developed, with kings and priests at the top, artisans and farmers in the middle, and slaves at the bottom. Inequality and hardship were as much a part of civilization as progress and achievement. Yet for all their struggles, the people of Mesopotamia had created something new in human history: a structured, enduring society bound by laws, beliefs, and shared memory. Their innovations laid the foundation for every civilization that followed. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the world had entered what we now call the Age of Cities. Humanity had moved beyond survival alone. It had created culture, history, and legacy. And though many of these early city-states would rise and fall, their impact would echo for thousands of years. As we continue, we will follow the thread of this story outward. From the plains of Mesopotamia, civilization spread to new lands, shaped by new rivers and new peoples. The Nile in Egypt, the Indus in South Asia, the Yellow River in China, all became cradles of early society. Each region brought its own brilliance, its own myths, and its own lessons. But it all began here, in Mesopotamia, where mud bricks formed walls, where canals carved life into deserts, and where stories pressed into clay gave humanity its first written voice. The rise of Sumer and the first cities. From the simple beginnings of farming villages, humanity in Mesopotamia took its next extraordinary leap: the creation of cities. Among the marshes and fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, between the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates, the world's first true urban centers emerged. This region came to be known as Sumer. Sumer was not a single kingdom at first, but a land dotted with independent city-states. Each had its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own way of life. The names of these cities still echo in our imaginations: Uruk, Uar, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur. Though built from simple mud bricks, they stood as mighty symbols of humanity's shift into organized society. Life in Sumer revolved around the city and its temple. At the heart of each city was a towering ziggurat, a stepped pyramid built to honor the gods. These ziggurats were not only religious centers, but also symbols of power, reminding everyone that both the ruler and the people lived under divine watch. In Uruk, the ziggurat dedicated to the goddess Inanna stood as one of the most impressive structures of its time, reaching skyward as if to touch the heavens. The Sumerians believed their cities were gifts from the gods. Each city was dedicated to a specific deity, who was thought to protect and guide its people. Uruk had Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Nippur was devoted to Enlil, the god of air and storms. Eridu, considered the very first city by the Sumerians themselves, honored Enki, the god of wisdom and water. To live in a city was to live under the shelter of a divine protector. But survival in Mesopotamia was not easy. The rivers that gave life to the land could also bring disaster. Floods could destroy entire harvests, while droughts could leave the soil cracked and barren. To manage these challenges, the Sumerians developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Canals, dikes, and reservoirs crisscrossed the land, carrying water to fields of barley, wheat, and dates. Agriculture became so productive that cities could support large populations, craftsmen, priests, and rulers who no longer had to farm themselves. With agriculture came surplus, and with surplus came trade. The Sumerians became skilled merchants, trading grain, textiles, and pottery for resources their land lacked, such as timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and precious stones from distant lands. In this way, Sumer became the hub of a vast trade network that stretched across the ancient Near East. But the true genius of the Sumerians lay not only in building cities or managing trade. They invented something far greater, something that would forever change human history: writing. Around 3200 BCE, Sumerian scribes began pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets using a reed stylus. This system, known as cuneiform, began as a way to record trade, taxes, and agricultural accounts. But over time, it grew into a tool for storytelling, lawmaking, and preserving human thought itself. Through cuneiform, the Sumerians created the world's first written literature, including myths, hymns, and epic tales. One of the earliest and most famous stories to come from Sumer was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that blended myth and history. Gilgamesh, said to be the king of Uruk, was described as two-thirds divine and one-third human. His adventures, seeking immortality, facing great beasts, and wrestling with the inevitability of death, captured the human struggle in a way that still resonates today. Through these stories, the Sumerians passed down not only their myths, but also their understanding of what it meant to be human. Society in Sumer was highly organized. At the top was the ruler, often seen as chosen by the gods. Below him were priests, administrators, and scribes who kept the city functioning. Merchants and craftsmen filled the markets with goods, while farmers worked the fields to feed the population. At the bottom of society were slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, who performed hard labor. This social order ensured that the city-states ran smoothly, though it also created deep divisions between classes. Sumerian rulers sought to leave their mark on history. They built walls around their cities for protection, canals for prosperity, and temples to honor their gods. Inscriptions carved into stone and written on clay tablets boast of victories in battle, the digging of canals, or the dedication of temples. For the first time in history, we can hear the voices of rulers from over 4,000 years ago, voices preserved in cuneiform script. But while each city-state thrived, they often clashed with one another. Wars between cities were common, usually fought over land and water rights. Kings would lead armies into battle, seeking to expand their influence or defend their territory. Victory was celebrated with triumphal inscriptions, while defeat could mean the destruction of an entire city. Despite their rivalries, the Sumerians shared a cultural identity. Their gods, their writing, their architecture, and their innovations spread across Mesopotamia, influencing every civilization that followed. Even as new powers rose, the memory of Sumer endured as the place where human civilization truly began. As centuries passed, Sumerian city-states grew more complex. The population of Uruk alone may have reached 50,000 at its height, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Streets were filled with the sounds of traders calling out their wares, craftsmen hammering metal or shaping clay, and priests chanting in the temples. At night, oil lamps flickered, casting shadows on the mud brick walls of homes and workshops. It was in these cities that humanity first experienced the challenges and the wonders of urban life. From managing resources to organizing armies, from worshiping gods to recording history, the Sumerians laid the foundation for every civilization that followed. And yet, as powerful as they seemed, the city-states of Sumer were fragile. Rivalries weakened them, while outside threats grew stronger. Soon, the great land of Sumer would face new challengers, ambitious leaders and rising powers that sought to unite Mesopotamia under their rule. The story of civilization was only just beginning. The Akkadian Empire and the first kings of conquest. The world of Sumer, with its bustling cities and thriving culture, was a remarkable achievement. But no civilization stands still forever. From the north, a new power emerged, one that would transform the patchwork of city-states into something entirely new, an empire. This was the dawn of the Akkadians, and at their heart stood one of the most legendary rulers in ancient history, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon's story begins humbly, almost mythically. Ancient tales describe him as a man of low birth, a foundling abandoned in a basket on the river, much like the later story of Moses. Rescued and raised by humble hands, Sargon rose through skill, ambition, and determination. By the time he seized power around 2334 BCE, he had transformed himself from an outsider into a conqueror whose name would echo for centuries. Unlike the Sumerians, who identified strongly with their individual cities, Sargon envisioned something greater. His empire stretched far beyond the Sumerian homeland, reaching into northern Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even as far as the Persian Gulf. Through conquest, alliances, and trade, he extended Akkadian influence across a vast territory. For the first time, people from distant lands were brought under a single system of rule. The Akkadians shared much with the Sumerians. They adopted cuneiform writing, but adapted it to their own Semitic language, creating one of the earliest written forms of Akkadian. They honored the Sumerian gods, though often under different names, blending cultures into a single tapestry. And they continued the building traditions of temples, canals, and palaces, though now on a scale that reflected the grandeur of empire rather than city. But the Akkadians also brought something new, the vision of centralized power. Sargon appointed loyal officials, often his own family members, to govern far-flung regions. Armies were no longer temporary levies raised for specific conflicts, but professional forces maintained year-round. This new system allowed Sargon to keep control over lands that stretched far beyond what any Sumerian city-state had ever dreamed. Daily life under the Akkadians likely felt both familiar and changed. Farmers still worked the land, traders still journeyed along rivers and across deserts, and priests still performed rituals in towering temples. But now, they did so in the name of an empire, under the shadow of Akkad's kings. Tribute and taxes flowed to the capital, supporting the machinery of rule and the ambitions of its rulers. Sargon reigned for decades, establishing a dynasty that carried his vision forward. His grandson Naram-Sin took Akkadian power to its peak. Naram-Sin declared himself not just king, but king of the four quarters, a title claiming dominion over the entire world. He even went further than any ruler before him, proclaiming himself a living god, with temples dedicated to his worship. For the first time in Mesopotamian history, a mortal ruler claimed divine status, elevating kingship into something sacred and absolute. Under Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire flourished. Trade expanded, art and literature thrived, and monumental inscriptions celebrated the king's victories. One famous stele shows Naram-Sin ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies, while wearing a horned helmet, the symbol of divinity. The message was clear. The empire was strong, its ruler favored by the gods, and its power unshakable. Yet, like all human endeavors, the Akkadian Empire faced challenges it could not overcome. After Naram-Sin's reign, pressures mounted from within and without. Rebellions flared in distant provinces. The Sumerian cities, never entirely comfortable under Akkadian dominance, pushed back against centralized control. And from the surrounding regions, new peoples began pressing against the empire's borders. one of the most mysterious threats came from the Gutians, a group from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Described in later Sumerian writings as barbaric and uncivilized, the Gutians invaded Mesopotamia, toppling the weakened Akkadian rulers. For the Sumerians, this period was remembered as a dark age, when order collapsed and prosperity gave way to chaos. But external invasions were not the only problem. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mesopotamia may have also suffered from severe environmental stress during this time. Droughts, declining harvests, and overuse of the land may have weakened the empire from within. Irrigation, while a blessing, could also lead to the buildup of salt in the soil, reducing fertility. As the rivers shifted and fields yielded less, the empire's foundation crumbled. By around 2150 BCE, the once mighty Akkadian Empire had fallen. Its cities lay weakened, its rulers dethroned, and its memory preserved only in fragments of inscriptions and later tales. Yet its legacy endured. The Akkadians had demonstrated for the first time that a single ruler could unite diverse peoples under one rule. They established patterns of administration, military organization, and imperial ideology that future empires, from Babylon to Assyria, would adopt and expand upon. The idea of empire itself, born with Sargon, would shape human history for millennia to come. And even after its fall, the language of Akkad continued. For centuries, Akkadian remained the lingua franca of diplomacy and scholarship across the Near East. Long after the city of Akkad itself was lost, its language and culture lived on, woven into the story of Mesopotamia. As the dust of the Akkadian Empire settled, Mesopotamia entered a new phase. The Gutians ruled briefly but left little behind, remembered more for disruption than for innovation. But out of the chaos, the Sumerians themselves rose once more. Cities like Lagash and Uruk regained strength, ushering in what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance. This rebirth would bring new kings, new temples, and new works of literature, as the old traditions of Sumer blended with the lessons learned from Akkad. For while empires may fall, the spirit of civilization endures, adapting and reshaping itself with every generation. And so, the cradle of civilization turned once more, preparing for another era of glory and decline. The Sumerian Renaissance and the third dynasty of Ur. The fall of the Akkadian Empire might have seemed like the end of Mesopotamia's unity, but history often moves in cycles. Out of the chaos of Gutian rule and the collapse of centralized power, the old Sumerian cities stirred once more. The people who had first built civilization were not ready to fade away. Instead, they reclaimed their heritage and entered what historians now call the Sumerian Renaissance. At the heart of this rebirth stood the city of Ur, one of the most powerful and enduring centers of Sumerian culture. Around 2100 BCE, a new dynasty rose to prominence, the third dynasty of Ur, often abbreviated as Ur3. Under its kings, Sumerian civilization reached one last golden age before finally giving way to new powers. The rise of Ur-Nemu. The dynasty began with Ur-Nemu, a ruler who restored stability after years of Gutian disruption. Ur-Nemu consolidated control over the southern cities, re-established order, and built an empire that rivaled that of the Akkadians, though firmly rooted in Sumerian traditions. He is perhaps best remembered for his contributions to law and order. Ur-Nemu issued one of the earliest known legal codes in human history, even older than the famous Code of Hammurabi. Written in cuneiform, it set out rules for justice, penalties for wrongdoing, and standards for society. While only fragments survive, it shows how deeply the Sumerians valued fairness and structure in their communities. Ur-Nemu also invested heavily in monumental architecture. He began the construction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive step pyramid that still rises, partially preserved, from the desert today. Built from mud brick and faced with baked brick, it towered over the city as a symbol of religious devotion and royal power. Dedicated to the moon god Nana, it reminded the people of Ur that their king ruled under divine favor. Shulgi, the scholar king. Ur-Nemu's son, Shulgi, carried the dynasty to even greater heights. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, and during that time, he transformed Ur into the cultural and political heart of Mesopotamia. He expanded his father's empire, securing its borders and maintaining control through both military strength and careful administration. But Shulgi was not only a warrior king, he was also a patron of the arts and scholarship. He celebrated himself as a poet, a singer, and even a scribe, claiming mastery of writing and literature. Under his reign, scribal schools flourished, producing thousands of tablets that preserved myths, hymns, legal documents, and administrative records. Thanks to Shulgi's support, we possess one of the richest collections of Sumerian literature, including tales of heroes, laments, and songs to the gods. Shulgi also reorganized the empire's bureaucracy. Provinces were carefully managed by governors loyal to the throne. Taxes and tribute flowed steadily into Ur, and a system of record-keeping ensured that every detail of trade, agriculture, and labor was tracked. Clay tablets filled with accounts reveal a society of astonishing complexity, where everything from the number of sheep in a herd to the distribution of grain was carefully documented. Life under Shulgi's rule must have seemed prosperous and orderly. Farmers worked fields irrigated by vast canal systems. Merchants traveled to distant lands, trading wool, textiles, and grain for copper, tin, and luxury goods. Priests conducted elaborate rituals in the temples, honoring the gods with offerings and festivals. And in the shadow of Ur's great ziggurat, people must have felt they lived at the center of a flourishing world. The fragility of empire. But as with the Akkadians before them, the Ur3 dynasty faced challenges that would eventually undermine its strength. Shulgi's successors struggled to maintain the same level of control. Invasions from the east by the Elamites and pressure from western nomadic groups, like the Amorites, strained the empire's defenses. At the same time, the empire's highly centralized bureaucracy, which had once been a source of strength, became a burden. The constant demand for taxes, labor, and resources may have weighed heavily on the population. When the system worked, it provided prosperity. But when stress mounted, it became rigid and vulnerable to collapse. Environmental pressures may have played a role as well. The land of southern Mesopotamia, farmed for centuries, suffered from salinization as irrigation left behind deposits of salt in the soil. Crops became harder to grow, and food shortages placed added strain on the people. By the end of the 21st century BCE, the empire was faltering. Cities rebelled, provinces broke away, and foreign invasions grew bolder. Finally, around 2004 BCE, the Elamites swept into Ur, plundering the city and bringing the Ur3 dynasty to a dramatic end. The great ziggurat still stood, but the empire it symbolized had fallen. The legacy of Ur. Yet, just as the Akkadians left their mark, so too did the kings of Ur. Their emphasis on law, bureaucracy, and monumental architecture set patterns that influenced later civilizations. Their literature preserved the myths and traditions of Sumer, ensuring they would echo long after the cities themselves faded. Even in their decline, the Sumerians showed resilience. Though their political power waned, their cultural influence endured. Their gods, stories, and innovations became the foundation upon which future civilizations would build. As the third dynasty of Ur crumbled, Mesopotamia entered yet another transitional period. New peoples were on the rise, bringing with them fresh energy and new ideas. Among them were the Amorites, who would soon establish one of the most famous cities in all of history, Babylon. And with Babylon came a new chapter, one of kings lawgivers, and an empire whose name would resound for thousands of years. The rise of Babylon and Hammurabi's Code. The fall of the third dynasty of Ur left Mesopotamia fractured once again. Cities sought independence, local rulers fought for power, and foreign invaders pressed in from the edges. Yet, as always in this ancient land, decline was followed by rebirth. Out of the shifting sands of power, one city rose to prominence above all others, Babylon. At first, Babylon was just a modest settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River. But under the leadership of the Amorites, a people who had moved into Mesopotamia from the west, it grew into the heart of a new kingdom. By the early 18th century BCE, Babylon was transformed into the capital of an empire, thanks to the brilliance and ambition of one man, Hammurabi. Hammurabi's rise. Hammurabi came to the throne around 1792 BC. At first, he was just one king among many in a divided Mesopotamia. To the north lay powerful rivals like Mari and Assyria. To the south, cities such as Larsa still held sway. But Hammurabi was patient. He strengthened Babylon internally before turning outward. Over the course of decades, through both diplomacy and war, Hammurabi expanded his influence. He formed alliances, broke them when necessary, and skillfully exploited rivalries between other states. One by one, his opponents fell. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had united nearly all of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control, creating an empire that rivaled even Sargon's Akkadian domain centuries before. A city of splendor. Under Hammurabi, Babylon flourished. Though much of the grandeur we associate with the city, its towering walls, the hanging gardens, and its later imperial might, came centuries later. The foundations were laid during his reign. Babylon became known not just as a political center, but as a hub of culture, religion, and administration. Temples dedicated to Babylon's patron god, Marduk, rose in splendor. Over time, Marduk would become one of the most important deities in Mesopotamian religion, elevated above many of the older gods. Festivals in his honor brought the community together, reinforcing Babylon's central role in both politics and faith. Hammurabi's Code of Laws. But Hammurabi's most enduring legacy was not just conquest or construction. It was his vision of law and justice. Around 1754 BCE, he had a set of laws inscribed on a large stone stele, written in cuneiform for all to see. This became known as the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous documents in human history. The code contained nearly 300 laws, covering everything from trade and property to marriage, inheritance, and crime. Its guiding principle was clear: to establish justice and order in society. Hammurabi claimed the laws were given to him by the gods, particularly Shamash, the god of justice, whose image appears carved above the laws on the stele. The punishments were often harsh, based on the principle of an eye for an eye. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder could be put to death. If someone stole from a temple or palace, the penalty was execution. Yet, the code also offered protection to the weak, including widows, orphans, and the poor, reflecting Hammurabi's desire to be seen as a just and paternal ruler. What made the code revolutionary was not just its content, but its permanence. By inscribing the laws on stone, Hammurabi declared that justice was not arbitrary. It was fixed, knowable, and available for all to see. For the first time in history, law became something written, public, and enduring. Daily life in Babylon. Life under Hammurabi's Babylon would have seemed both familiar and advanced to those who remembered Sumer or Akkad. Farmers worked the fertile plains, aided by irrigation canals that carried the Euphrates waters to their fields. Merchants thrived in the marketplaces, trading goods across long-distance routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. Craftsmen and artisans filled the city with pottery, textiles, and metalwork, while scribes recorded contracts, trade agreements, and court decisions on clay tablets. In the temples, priests performed rituals to keep the gods appeased, ensuring the prosperity of the land. For ordinary Babylonians, daily life revolved around work, family, and worship, all structured under the stability that Hammurabi's laws sought to provide. The limits of power. Despite Hammurabi's brilliance, his empire did not last long after his death. Maintaining unity across Mesopotamia was always a challenge. His successors lacked his skill and authority, and soon rival powers re-emerged. The Hittites from Anatolia swept down and briefly sacked Babylon in the 16th century BCE, signaling the fragility of even the mightiest kingdoms. Yet, while political control shifted, Babylon remained a symbol of power and prestige. Even when dominated by others, the city retained its cultural and religious significance. In the centuries to come, it would rise again, greater than ever, under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II. Hammurabi's legacy. Hammurabi's reign marked a turning point in Mesopotamian history. He demonstrated that a city could not only dominate militarily, but also shape society through the rule of law. His code influenced later legal systems across the ancient Near East and even echoes in the principles of modern justice. Perhaps more importantly, Hammurabi solidified Babylon's place at the center of Mesopotamian life. Even as empires rose and fell, the name Babylon would endure, becoming a byword for greatness, splendor, and sometimes excess. And as Hammurabi's empire waned, new powers began to emerge. To the north, Assyria was gathering strength, building on its warrior traditions and laying the groundwork for one of the most formidable empires the world had ever seen. The stage was set for Mesopotamia's next transformation, one that would carry its influence far beyond its own borders. The Assyrian Empire and the Age of Iron Conquest. While Babylon left its mark with laws, literature, and culture, another force was rising in the north, fierce, disciplined, and relentless. The people of Assyria, settled along the upper Tigris River, began as traders and farmers. But over centuries, they transformed into some of the most formidable warriors the ancient world had ever seen. Their empire would stretch across vast lands, their armies feared from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. This was the Age of Assyria, an era of conquest, iron, and imperial might. The roots of Assyria. The city of Ashur, named after the chief god of the Assyrians, was the earliest center of their culture. At first, Assyria was simply a city-state, trading with Babylonian and Sumerian neighbors. But as the centuries passed, Assyria grew stronger, benefiting from its strategic location on trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia and the Levant. Early kings like Shamshid I began the process of expanding Assyrian influence, but it was not until the first millennium BCE that Assyria became a true empire. By then, a combination of military innovation, organization, and sheer determination propelled them to dominance. Masters of war, the Assyrians became known above all for their military power. They were among the first to make widespread use of iron weapons, stronger and more durable than the bronze used by earlier civilizations. Their armies included skilled archers, heavily armored infantry, swift cavalry, and powerful siege engines. Cities that had once seemed impregnable now crumbled before Assyrian battering rams and towers. But it was not just their weapons that made them formidable. It was their discipline and organization. The Assyrian army was professional, maintained year-round, and commanded with ruthless efficiency. Conquest was not a temporary campaign. It was a way of life, systematically expanding the empire's borders and securing its wealth. The Assyrians also ruled with fear. When cities resisted, they faced brutal punishment. Captives were deported, populations relocated, and rebellious rulers executed. These harsh tactics, though cruel, ensured obedience and discouraged resistance. To their enemies, the Assyrians were remembered as destroyers. But to themselves, they were bringers of order and power. The rise of an empire. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria was rapidly expanding. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II established grand capitals such as Nimrud, adorned with palaces, temples, and colossal winged statues known as Lamassu, guardians that combined the body of a bull, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a human. These monuments projected strength and divine protection. Later rulers carried expansion even further. Tiglath-Pileser III reorganized the empire, introducing provinces ruled directly by Assyrian governors rather than relying on vassals. This centralization gave Assyria greater control over its vast territories. Under Sargon II and his successors, the empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, and from Anatolia down into Egypt. The capital cities of Assyria became showcases of imperial power. Nineveh, perhaps the most famous, grew into a metropolis with grand walls, palaces decorated with detailed carvings, and gardens that rivaled any in the ancient world. Inside its libraries, scribes collected thousands of clay tablets, preserving the knowledge of Mesopotamia. The library of Ashurbanipal, one of the last great Assyrian kings, contained myths, medical texts, prayers, and epics, including copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Through these collections, the Assyrians became not just conquerors, but also preservers of culture. Life under Assyrian rule. For ordinary people, life in the Assyrian Empire was a mix of fear and opportunity. Conquered peoples were often relocated, their communities broken up to prevent rebellion. Yet at the same time, the empire's vast reach brought prosperity through trade. Goods from across the ancient world flowed into Assyrian markets. Cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, horses from the steppes, and precious stones from India. The Assyrians also invested in infrastructure. Roads connected distant provinces, canals irrigated fields, and monumental architecture displayed the empire's wealth. While their harsh methods are remembered most vividly, the Assyrians also built a system that allowed communication, commerce, and governance on a scale never before seen. The fall of Assyria. Yet, as with every empire before them, Assyria's power carried within it the seeds of decline. Constant warfare drained resources and created enemies on all sides. The harshness of Assyrian rule bred resentment among subject peoples, who waited for the moment to rise against their masters. By the late 7th century BCE, that moment came. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes joined forces, attacking the heart of the empire. In 612 BCE, the great city of Nineveh fell after a brutal siege. The once mighty Assyrian Empire collapsed almost overnight. Its cities burned, its people scattered. For centuries, Assyria had ruled through fear and force, but its end came with shocking swiftness. Its memory lived on, preserved in the ruins of its capitals and in the records of its enemies, who rejoiced at its downfall. The Assyrian legacy. Though feared in their time, the Assyrians left a lasting impact. They perfected methods of imperial administration, military organization, and infrastructure that would influence future empires, from Persia to Rome. Their art and architecture, especially the winged lamassu and detailed wall reliefs, remain among the most striking images of the ancient Near East. And in the libraries of Nineveh, the knowledge of earlier civilizations was preserved, allowing future generations to rediscover the myths, stories, and wisdom of Mesopotamia. With Assyria's fall, the torch of Mesopotamian civilization passed once more, this time back to Babylon. Under the Neo-Babylonian kings, the city would rise again in glory, creating wonders that would echo through history. The Neo-Babylonians, Persia, and the last echo of Mesopotamia. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed in 612 BCE, the world shifted once again. The city of Babylon, long overshadowed, rose to become the new heart of Mesopotamia. Under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this ancient land experienced one last flowering of greatness before vanishing into the folds of history. The rise of Neo-Babylon. The destruction of Nineveh allowed Babylon to emerge as the dominant power of the Near East. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, the Babylonians, allied with the Medes, had helped bring Assyria down. But it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who transformed Babylon into a city of wonder. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and during this time, Babylon reached its peak. The city became a marvel of the ancient world, its walls towering and strong, its temples radiant with gold, and its ziggurat, often linked with the biblical Tower of Babel, rising proudly above the skyline. The glory of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's greatest achievement was the beautification of Babylon. The famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with dazzling blue-glazed bricks and images of lions, bulls, and dragons, symbolized both divine protection and imperial power. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a grand avenue used for religious festivals. Legend also tells us of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, said to be built by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Though historians debate whether these gardens truly existed, the image of lush terraces overflowing with trees and flowers in the middle of a desert city has endured as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Babylon was also a center of learning and science. Astronomers observed the heavens, recording the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision. These records influenced later Greek astronomy and, eventually, the foundations of modern science. Mathematics, too, advanced here, building on centuries of Mesopotamian knowledge. The shadows of empire. Yet, even in its golden age, Babylon faced challenges. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns expanded the empire's territory, but his successors lacked his strength. Internal strife, weak kings, and foreign threats slowly eroded the stability of the Neo-Babylonian state. By the mid-6th century BCE, a new power was rising in the east, the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. With vision and strategy, Cyrus began building an empire larger and more enduring than any before. The fall of Babylon. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched against Babylon. According to later accounts, he diverted the Euphrates River, allowing his troops to enter the city under its walls. Remarkably, Babylon fell without major destruction. Cyrus declared himself not a conqueror, but a liberator, respecting the city's gods and traditions. For the people of Babylon, it was the end of their independence, but not the end of their city. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained important, but the age of Mesopotamian dominance was over. From this point onward, the great empires of the region would speak Persian, Greek, and Arabic, not Sumerian or Akkadian. The final echo of Mesopotamia. Over time, the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia crumbled back into the earth. The Euphrates and Tigris shifted their courses, burying ruins in sand and silt. What was once the cradle of civilization became a land of forgotten ziggurats, broken statues, and silent tablets. And yet, the echoes of Mesopotamia never truly disappeared. Their inventions, the wheel, the plow, writing, astronomy, law, formed the foundation of future civilizations. Their myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, continued to inspire. Their vision of cities, kingship, and human destiny shaped the very concept of civilization itself. Mesopotamia was not just the birthplace of one empire. It was the birthplace of all empires. Each that followed, Persia, Greece, Rome, carried pieces of its legacy forward, from mud bricks to myths. So, as we trace this journey, from the first mud brick villages of Sumer to the grand palaces of Babylon, and finally to the Persian conquest, we witness the full arc of humanity's first civilization. The land between the rivers was a place of beginnings, the beginning of cities, writing, laws, and dreams of immortality. It was also a place of endings, of towers toppled, empires destroyed, and cultures absorbed. And yet, the memory of Mesopotamia endures, whispered through myths, carried in stories, and written in the very structure of the societies that followed. To fall asleep to this story is to drift into the cradle of civilization itself, a land where humanity first dared to build, to write, to question the stars, and to imagine eternity. From mud bricks to myths, this is where it all began.